Anne was Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland from 1702 until her death in 1714. In 1707, the Acts of Union united England and Scotland as one sovereign state and was named Great Britain, and this act also united Ireland with England. Despite her numerous pregnancies, none of these resulted in surviving children, and as such, Anne was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. Her successor was George I, her German second cousin from Hanover. Anne was born on the 6th of February 1665 to James II and 7th and Anne Hyde. Though Anne was one of 8 children born to her parents, only Anne and her elder sister Mary survived adulthood. From an early age, Anne suffered from an eye condition known as defluxion, which causes excessive watering. She was sent to France for medical assistance, and she lived with her grandmother Henrietta Maria of France and then her aunt Henrietta Anne. In 1670, her aunt died and Anne returned to England. In 1671, Anne's mother died. Anne and Mary were raised in a separate home from their father, as was the norm at the time, and were raised Protestant despite their father being Catholic. In 1671, Anne met Sarah Jennings, later Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and she would have a considerable amount of influence on the Queen. In 1673, James married Mary of Modena, a Catholic princess, not much older than Anne. Anne and her stepmother got on well. In 1677, Mary married William III of Orange. Anne was unable to attend the wedding as she had smallpox. George of Hanover, Anne's second cousin, visited London in 1680, and there were rumours of a potential marriage between them. However, this never happened, as the Hanoverians planned for George to marry Sophia Dorothea of Celle. King Charles looked for an eligible Protestant prince as a husband for Anne. The match had to be acceptable to Louis XIV of France, an ally of Charles. The Danish royal family were allies of the French, and so a marriage was proposed between Anne and Prince George of Denmark, the younger brother of Christian V. The couple were wed on the 28th of July 1683. Despite it being an arranged marriage, Anne and George were faithful and devoted to each other. Soon after the wedding, Anne became pregnant, but the baby was stillborn. Over the next 2 years, Anne gave birth to 2 daughters, Mary and Anne Sophia. In 1685, Anne's father ascended the throne as James II and 7th. As her father began to weaken the Church of England's power, Anne became estranged from her father and stepmother. In 1687, Anne miscarried. George got smallpox, and their 2 daughters died of smallpox. In 1688, Anne's stepmother gave birth to a son, James. Rumours of the child not being James's or being an adopted child grew rampant. That year, William of Orange invaded England along with his wife Mary, the daughter of James II and 7th, and they deposed of King James. Anne was supportive of this action. In January 1689, Mary and William were declared joint monarchs. That same year, Anne gave birth to a son, William. Around this time, Anne and Sarah became closer. In 1692, Sarah's husband was dismissed from his offices after William and Mary suspected him of conspiring with the Jacobites, King James's followers. Anne took a stance to support Sarah at a social event and refused to remove her from her household. This caused a rift between Anne and Mary, which never healed. In 1694, Mary died of smallpox and William was left to rule alone. Anne gave birth for the last time in 1700. She had been pregnant 17 times. Only 5 of her children lived to the age of 2, and only 1 survived past the age of 10. However, none survived adulthood. From 1698, Anne suffered from bouts of gout, causing her immense pain, and she was either carried on a sedan chair or used a wheelchair. She also gained weight as a result of her sedentary lifestyle. William, the sole surviving child of Anne and George, died at the age of 11 in 1700. His death devastated his parents, who would observe a day of mourning every year on his anniversary. As Anne was the sole person left in the line of succession, Parliament enacted the Act of Settlement in 1701, which named Sophia Electress of Hanover and her Protestant descendants as next in line after Anne. Anne became queen on the 8th of March 1702, after William III died. She was very popular with the people and was crowned on the 23rd of April 1702. Anne took a keen interest in affairs of state. Scotland was an independent state, and Anne declared that it was necessary for Scotland to be joined with England. In 1707, the Acts of Union declared England and Scotland together as Britain. In 1708, Anne's half-brother James Stuart attempted to land in Scotland with French assistance, but was unsuccessful. Anne may have been gay, as her passionate infatuations with 2 women, Sarah Churchill and Abigail Hill, through her life have been considered romantic and sexual in nature. In October 1708, George passed away and Anne was overcome by grief. The death of her husband was a turning point in her relationship with Sarah Churchill. Sarah insisted that the Queen leave Kensington Palace for St. James's Palace, and Sarah removed a portrait of George from the Queen's bedchamber. This infuriated the Queen, and she came to resent the Duchess. By 1713, Anne was in poor health. She was unable to walk much, and on her son's anniversary in 1714, Anne suffered a stroke. Becoming unable to speak, she passed away 2 days later on the 1st of August 1714. She was buried beside her husband and children on the 24th of August. Anne's heir, the Electress Sophia, had died 2 months previous, so George, Elector of Hanover, succeeded as King George I. Many traditional analyses of Anne conclude that she was influenced heavily by her favourites and that she lacked political astuteness. However, much of this is derived from misogyny. Anne's reign marked a noted increase in the influence of Parliament and the decrease in the influence of the Crown. She attended more cabinet meetings than any of her predecessors. The Union of England and Scotland created the largest free trade area in Europe at the time, and there was an absence of constitutional conflict between monarch and Parliament, indicating she made wise decisions.
The death of Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1817, the British monarchy was in shambles. The succession was in crisis, as Princess Charlotte was the only legitimate grandchild of George III. As a result of this, the remaining unmarried sons of George III married quickly to have children. In 1818, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the sister of Princess Charlotte's widower, Leopold. On the 23rd of May 1819, their only child, Alexandrina Victoria, was born at Kensington Palace. She was christened at Kensington Palace by the Archbishop of Canterbury and named after her godfather, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and her mother. Victoria was fifth in line to the throne after her father and his 3 older brothers, George, Frederick and William, as they had no living legitimate children. When Victoria was less than a year old, her father passed away, followed by her grandfather. In 1827, Frederick died, with George passing in 1830. She was now first in line to the throne. Victoria's childhood was sad and isolated. Her mother and her mother's friend Sir John Conroy devised the Kensington system, which prevented Victoria from meeting people that they deemed unworthy. They also hoped it would make her weak and dependent on them. Victoria didn't have her own room. She had to share with her mother. She studied plenty of languages, including English, French, German, Italian, and Latin, played with dolls, and her only companion was her dog Dash. From the age of 13, Victoria wrote a daily diary, and they were read by her mother, which Victoria put a stop to once she became queen. She continued this practice throughout her life, filling 122 volumes. During the 1830s, Victoria went on many trips throughout England and Wales, which she disliked as they made her ill and tired. In October 1835, Victoria fell ill, and Conroy and her mother tried to make her appoint Conroy as her secretary, which failed. In May 1836, Victoria met Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha for the first time. Her uncle Leopold hoped the two cousins would marry. However, William IV, Victoria's uncle, disapproved. While Victoria found Albert delightful, she was not ready for marriage. A month after Victoria turned 18, her uncle William IV passed away. She decided to take the regnal name of Victoria. Due to Victoria being a woman, she was unable to inherit the throne in Hanover. Her uncle Ernest Augustus succeeded as King of Hanover. He was Victoria's heir until she had a child. Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister at the time, formed a close relationship with the young Queen. He offered her much advice and was seen as a father figure by Victoria. Victoria's coronation took place on the 28th of June 1838 at Westminster Abbey. The first 2 years of her reign, Victoria was generally popular. However, a scandal would rock her court and her reputation would suffer. Rumours flew that Lady Flora Hastings, one of her mother's ladies-in-waiting, was pregnant with Conroy's child out of marriage. Victoria believed this to be true, and to determine if the rumour was true, Lady Flora was subjected to a medical examination to determine her virginity. The lady was a virgin, and the Queen's reputation suffered as a result of her maltreatment of Lady Flora, who was dying from cancer. Another situation which put Victoria in hot water was when she refused to replace her ladies-in-waiting with wives of the Tory party, something a new Prime Minister was allowed to do as a sign of neutrality on the part of the monarch not to meddle in politics. Peel, the new Prime Minister, found this Queen's stubbornness difficult to deal with and resigned. Melbourne returned to his office as Prime Minister. Despite being Queen, Victoria was not allowed to live by herself, due to social norms at the time. She found her mother's proximity stifling and had her sequestered to distant rooms of the palace. Melbourne offered up marriage as a solution, but Victoria was hesitant to marry when she had only just become Queen. Victoria met Albert again in October 1839, and after spending a few days with him, she proposed. On the 10th of February 1840, the young couple married in the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. Albert replaced Melbourne as the key political and non-political advisor in her life. Victoria soon became pregnant for the first time. While pregnant with her first child, she survived an assassination attempt by Edward Oxford. She was in her carriage with Prince Albert when Oxford shot at her. She was unharmed. and Oxford was arrested and tried for high treason but found not guilty due to insanity. He was detained in an asylum. Victoria's popularity rose. The couple's first child, Victoria Adelaide Mary Louisa, was born on the 21st of November 1840. Despite disliking pregnancy, the Queen went on to have 8 further children. Albert, born 1841, Alice, born 1843, Alfred, born 1844, Helena, born 1846, Louise, born 1848, Arthur, born 1850, Leopold, born 1853, and Beatrice, born 1857. Baroness Louise Lazen ran the Queen's household. She was Victoria's childhood governess and was highly influential on the Queen. Albert thought she mismanaged things and was angry over her treatment of their ill daughter. In 1842, to keep the peace with her husband, Lazen was asked to retire. Victoria survived further assassination attempts by John Francis on the 29th of May 1842 and John William Bean on the 3rd of July 1842. In 1845, Ireland became gripped by a potato blight. This became known as the Great Famine. Victoria became known as the Famine Queen, despite giving £2,000 of her own money to support the Irish people. Victoria would visit Ireland in 1849. In 1843 and 1845, Victoria and Albert stayed in France, with King Louis Philippe I becoming the first British monarch to visit a French monarch since Henry VIII. Louis Philippe returned the favour by visiting in 1844. During 1848, when the possibility of the British monarchy being deposed was of great concern, Victoria and her family left for Osborne House. In 1849, the Queen survived an assassination attempt by William Hamilton, and again in 1850 by Robert Pate. During her final 2 pregnancies, the Queen used chloroform during labour, which greatly improved the experience for her. It is possible that Victoria may have had postnatal depression following her pregnancies, as she was often gripped by feelings of sadness and loss of self-control. In 1851, Prince Albert opened the Great Exhibition to much success. Victoria's eldest child, Princess Victoria, married Prince Frederick William of Prussia in 1858. A year later, the Queen's first of many grandchildren would be born. In March 1861, the Duchess of Kent passed away. Over the years, the Queen and her mother had become much closer and shared a happier relationship than they had had when she was a child. Albert helped more during this time, driving himself to the point of illness several times. In November 1861, the couple became aware that their eldest son Albert was sleeping with an actress while stationed in Ireland. Prince Albert travelled to meet his son and confront him about the rumours. In December 1861, Prince Albert fell ill with typhoid fever and died on the 14th of December 1861, driving the Queen into a state of mourning. She blamed her son Albert. She wore black for the rest of her life, avoided the public and secluded herself at Windsor Castle. She rarely appeared in public. Her first public appearance in years was to visit the Royal Horticultural Society's gardens in Kensington. During the 1860s, Victoria became close with a manservant called John Brown from Scotland. They may have had a romantic relationship, but that is only speculation. She published a book called Leaves from the Journal of Her Life in the Highlands, in which she praised Brown a lot. In 1866, Victoria opened Parliament for the first time since her husband's death. She supported the Reform Act of 1867, which gave ordinary men the right to vote. However, she did not support women having the vote. When her son Albert grew seriously ill with typhoid fever in 1871, Victoria became distressed at the thought of losing her son the same way she lost her husband. However, the Prince of Wales recovered, and in 1872 the mother and son attended a grand service of thanksgiving, which helped dissipate the Republican movement. Victoria survived yet another assassination attempt. In 1872, Arthur O'Connor waved an unloaded gun at the Queen. John Brown grabbed him and he was arrested. This event improved the Queen's popularity. In 1876, the Prime Minister Disraeli introduced the Royal Titles Act of 1876, which enabled Victoria to take the title of Empress of India. On the 17th anniversary of Albert's death, Princess Alice, the Grand Duchess of Hessen by Rhine, died of diphtheria. This was her first child to die, and she was greatly upset by it. In May 1879, her first great-grandchild, Princess Theodora of Saxe-Meiningen, was born. During the 1870s, the Queen threatened to abdicate a number of times to pressure the PM to act in her favour, but each time it failed. Victoria was in favour of the expansion of the British Empire, believing it to be civilising and peaceful, and protecting the native people from cruel rulers. The Queen survived another assassination attempt in 1882 by Roderick MacLean. When he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, she was outraged but felt it was worth it to see how much one is loved, due to the outpouring of support following the attack. In 1883, Victoria fell down the stairs at Windsor Castle, and it left her suffering from rheumatism for the rest of her life. When John Brown died, the Queen published more leaves from a journal of a life in the Highlands in honour of Brown. In 1884, her youngest son, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, died. She was upset by this. In April 1884, Princess Beatrice fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg, but Victoria was horrified by the possibility of her daughter leaving her and opposed the match. After a year, she agreed to the match, so long as Beatrice and Henry remained nearby. The Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 1887 with a banquet. She also attended a Thanksgiving service in Westminster Abbey. She met Abdul Karim, one of 2 Indian waiters in attendance. She formed a close relationship with him. She promoted him to Munshi. He taught her Urdu and worked as a clerk for her. Her family were appalled. He returned to India upon her death. In 1888, Victoria's eldest daughter became the German Empress, but was widowed soon after. Victoria's eldest grandchild, Wilhelm, became German Emperor and was autocratic. In 1896, she became the longest reigning British monarch. In 1897, she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee with an open-air service outside St. Paul's Cathedral. In 1900, her second son Alfred died, and she noted that that year was horrible. The end of 1900, she was suffering from rheumatism in both her legs and cataracts in both her eyes. On the 22nd of January 1901, she passed away at the age of 81. Her son Albert succeeded her as Edward VII. Her eldest grandson, and her favourite pet Churi were at her deathbed. Her funeral was held on the 2nd of February 1901. Albert, Wilhelm and Arthur, her third son, lifted her body into the coffin. She wore a white dress and her wedding veil, and had a large collection of mementos placed around her in the coffin by family, friends and servants. One of her husband's dressing gowns and a plaster cast of his hand, as well as a lock of John Brown's hair and a picture of him, were placed in the coffin. She also had a bunch of flowers. She was eventually interred beside her beloved Prince Albert at the Windsor Great Park. She ruled for 63 years.
Elizabeth II is the eldest child of George VI and his wife Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. In 1936, her father ascended the throne after his brother abdicated. At 10 years old, Elizabeth was thrust into the position of heir presumptive, and only 16 years later, she ascended the throne herself after the premature death of her father. Elizabeth was born on the 21st of April 1926 to George VI, born Albert, and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She was born during the reign of George V. At the time of her birth, her parents were the Duke and Duchess of York. Elizabeth was nicknamed Lilibet by her family, based off what she called herself when she was a toddler. Elizabeth had only one other sibling, Princess Margaret, who was born in 1930, and the two sisters were very close, being educated together at home by their governess Marion Crawford. As a young child, Elizabeth was quite sensible and mature for her age. Elizabeth was never expected to become queen. Until 1936, she was third in line to the throne after her uncle Edward VIII and her father, and it was expected that her uncle would marry and have children. However, that all changed when her grandfather George V died and her uncle Edward VIII became king. He abdicated only 11 months later to marry Wallis Simpson, and Elizabeth's father became king. As such, Elizabeth became heir presumptive. She was not heir apparent, as male preference primogeniture was in use at the time, and if her parents had another child, a son, Elizabeth would not be the heir. From then on, Elizabeth would also receive education in constitutional history in Eton College. A Girl Guides company was set up in Buckingham Palace so Elizabeth and Margaret could meet with girls their own age. In 1939, World War II started and the royal family lived in Balmoral Castle, then Sandringham House, before living in Windsor Castle for the duration of the war. During the war, the princesses staged pantomimes. In 1940, Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast addressing the children of the UK to raise spirits. In 1942, Elizabeth was appointed Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, and she visited them the following year during her first solo public appearance. In 1944, Elizabeth was made one of the 5 councillors of state in case her father became incapacitated. During the war, Elizabeth trained as a driver and mechanic, achieving the rank of honorary junior commander. The war ended in Europe in May 1945, and Elizabeth and Margaret went into the crowds in secret in the streets of London to celebrate. In 1947, Elizabeth went on her first overseas tour to South Africa, and she made her famous pledge on the 21st birthday that she would devote herself to the Commonwealth and to her country. By the time the speech was made, Elizabeth was secretly engaged to Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, her second cousin once removed. They had met in 1934 and began exchanging letters. In July 1947, their engagement was publicly announced. The match was met with both support and opposition. Philip was a foreign-born prince with little money and whose sisters had married German men with Nazi links. The marriage went ahead anyway, with Philip renouncing his Greek and Danish titles and converting to Anglicanism. Before the wedding, Philip was given the title of Duke of Edinburgh and His Royal Highness. Elizabeth and Philip married on the 20th of November 1947 and were followed just under a year later by a son, Charles, and a daughter, Anne, in 1950. The early years of their marriage were generally happy, with the couple living abroad intermittently in Malta. As the king's health began to fail, Elizabeth stood in for him. In early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip went on a tour of Australia and New Zealand, stopping in Kenya first. On the 6th of February 1952, the king died, and Philip broke the news to Elizabeth. She had left the UK as a princess and returned as a queen. She chose the regnal name of Elizabeth and was thus Elizabeth II. One of the first issues that came up was the name of the royal house. As was customary at the time, When a woman married a man, the woman would take the man's surname, and her children would have their father's surname. Several people assumed the royal house's name would be Mountbatten, but this was disliked by Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister at the time, and Elizabeth's grandmother, Queen Mary, who had been there when the house's name was first changed to Windsor in 1917. In April 1952, a declaration was issued stating that Windsor would continue to be the name of the royal house, and in 1960 the surname of Mountbatten Windsor would be used from then on by the male line descendants of Elizabeth and Philip who did not carry royal titles, as is the case in Prince Edward's children. Queen Mary died in March 1953, less than 3 months before the coronation. Mary had requested that the coronation go ahead as planned before her death. On the 2nd of June 1953, the coronation was held and was the first to be televised, except the anointing and communion parts of the ceremony. Elizabeth and Philip went on a 7-month tour of the Commonwealth in 1953, and Elizabeth was the first British monarch to visit Australia and New Zealand. As monarch, one of the few powers she held was to appoint a Prime Minister. In 1963, Elizabeth appointed the Earl of Home as Prime Minister on the advice of the previous Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. However, the move was criticised, and in 1965 Elizabeth was relieved of this power after the Conservatives adopted a mechanism of electing a new leader. 9 years after Anne's birth, Elizabeth gave birth to her third child, Andrew, the first child to be born to a reigning British monarch since 1857, and her fourth child, Edward, was born in 1964. In 1972, Elizabeth toured Yugoslavia, becoming the first British monarch to visit a communist country. In 1977, Elizabeth celebrated her Silver Jubilee, and the following year, Lord Mountbatten, her uncle-in-law, was assassinated by the Provisional IRA, a blow to the royal family. During the 80s, the Queen survived 2 assassination attempts, one during the Trooping of the Colour in 1981 and the second while in New Zealand, also in 1981. What became known as her Annus Horribilis, 1992, marked the end of 2 of her children's marriages. Andrew separated from his wife Sarah in March, and Anne divorced Captain Mark Phillips in April. Mauritius removed Elizabeth as head of state, and a fire broke out in Windsor Castle. During the 80s and 90s, the media began to intrude more into the lives of the royal family, often publishing things such as photos and videos and audio tapes without the permission of the royal family. In 1993, the Queen sued the Sun newspaper after it published the text of her annual Christmas message days before it was to air. In August 1997, Princess Diana was killed in a car crash. The Queen's popularity greatly diminished during this brief period after the Queen failed to appear for a week and also failed to fly the flag over Buckingham Palace at half-mast. 2002 marked the Queen's Golden Jubilee and her 55th wedding anniversary. Her sister and her mother passed away in early 2002, and this dealt a hard blow to the Queen to lose 2 very close members of her family. In 2007, Elizabeth became the first British monarch to celebrate a diamond wedding anniversary, and in 2011, she became the first British monarch to visit the Republic of Ireland. 2012 marked 60 years on the throne for Elizabeth, and she became the first head of state to open 2 Olympics, the first being in 1976. In 2015, she became the longest reigning British monarch, surpassing her great-great-grandmother Queen Victoria. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK, and the Queen, with her husband, moved to Windsor Castle. On the 6th of April 2021, Prince Philip died at the age of 99, with Elizabeth by his side. As COVID-19 restrictions were in place, only 30 people were allowed to attend the funeral. That Christmas, she remarked about Philip: "That mischievous, inquiring twinkle was as bright at the end as when I first set eyes on him." On the 6th of February 2022, Elizabeth became the first British monarch to reach 70 years on the throne. Due to health reasons, she missed the state opening of Parliament for the first time in 59 years. Charles, her son, and William, her grandson, opened Parliament for her. She attended the first day of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations, but was unfortunately unable to attend the rest, with various other members of her family taking the lead for her. On the 8th of September 2022, Buckingham Palace released a statement to the public stating that the Queen was under medical supervision. Members of her immediate family, including her 4 children, travelled to Balmoral Castle, where the Queen was staying. That afternoon, Queen Elizabeth passed away at the age of 96. Her death was announced to the public that evening. Her cause of death was recorded as old age. She had been Queen for 70 years, longer than any previous British monarch, and the second longest reign ever recorded for a head of state or monarch. Her funeral was held on the 19th of September 2022, and she was interred at the King George VI Memorial Chapel beside her parents, her sister, and her husband. She was immediately succeeded by her eldest son, Charles III, as King of the United Kingdom.